You know when you feel the loneliness before you're even alone? Like your heart already knows they're not staying. For the ones who never felt enough, this is for you. This is the quiet panic that makes you stay in places that don't even feel like love. And this is why you said yes when everything in you was screaming no. You didn't lower your standards all at once. It was small, quiet, and slow, like a leak in a boat you kept patching with hope. You laughed at jokes that weren't funny. You apologized when you weren't wrong. You held your breath around them so they could breathe easier. You accepted confusion and called it just complicated. But deep down, you knew you weren't being chosen. You were being convenient. You stopped asking for clarity because the silence was safer than the answer. You didn't want to know if they cared. You just wanted them to not leave. And that's where it started, the belief that maybe love was just about not being abandoned, not about being adored, not about being seen. The solution doesn't come from demanding more from others. It comes from remembering who you were before you begged for crumbs. You were whole before them. You just forgot. Because loneliness doesn't mean you're not loved. It just means you're in a space waiting for real love to arrive. And it will. But not while you're still making room for people who only show up when it's easy. So before you fall for the next person who doesn't know what they want, remember this. You never had to shrink to be kept. You were just afraid that being your full self meant no one would stay. That's not true. The right ones don't get scared off by your standards. They rise to meet them. If you're too forgiving, keep watching. Because this is about the moment you gave up your boundaries just to feel chosen. You knew what you needed: communication, respect, reassurance. But the second they started pulling away, you called those things too much. You convinced yourself that being easygoing would make them stay. That if you stopped asking, they'd finally want to give. They didn't. And you still stayed. They said, "I'm just bad at texting," and you accepted it like a diagnosis. They said, "I'm not ready for anything serious," and you nodded even though your whole soul was craving commitment. You didn't just accept less. You rewrote your entire definition of love around their lack of effort. You made excuses for them before they could make one for themselves. And every time you did, a piece of you disappeared. That's the first standard you lowered. Emotional honesty, not theirs, yours. You knew what you needed but chose silence instead. Because if you never said it out loud, then they couldn't reject it. That silence became your cage. The second standard you dropped was being pursued. You stopped expecting to be called first, asked out, made to feel special. You thought if you showed how low maintenance you were, they'd see how lucky they were to have you. But all they saw was how little they had to do to keep you. Here's the shift. You don't need to prove you're easy to love by making yourself small. The people who are serious about you won't need convincing. They'll meet you in the middle. They'll call without you asking. They'll stay without you begging. You won't have to shrink for love that's real. This video is for the people who still wait for closure only. Because this is where it gets painful. You lowered your standards around respect. You let them talk to you in ways that made your chest tighten. You let the jokes slide, the ghosting slide, the back and forth slide, because calling it out felt like too much. So you stayed quiet, again. You believed if you kept being understanding, they'd eventually understand you. But they didn't. They just got used to your silence. You started measuring your worth by how much pain you could hold without speaking up. That's not strength. That's survival. You stayed when you were clearly an option. You showed up when they didn't. You forgave things that weren't accidents. And you told yourself it was love because the alternative, being alone, felt worse. That's how they trained you to think loyalty means staying through disrespect. But let me tell you what love actually looks like. It looks like being able to speak your mind without fear. It looks like being listened to the first time. It looks like your pain mattering. If you have to tolerate being treated like an afterthought just to keep them, you're not in love. You're in fear. And that leads to the fourth standard, exclusivity. You said you were okay with not labeling it. You pretended you didn't care who else they were talking to, but deep down, you were dying inside. You kept thinking if you just stayed chill, they'd eventually choose you. No, they chose what was easiest, and you let them. But here's the truth. Love that makes you question your worth isn't love, it's insecurity feeding on your softness. And you deserve more than being someone's maybe. Only people with quiet sadness will get this. Because the next standard you dropped was consistency. Not just in them, but in what you allowed. You stopped expecting steady love. You got used to emotional roller coasters. One day they'd reply like you mattered. The next, it was silence. You started calling this passion. You told yourself this was just how it felt to fall hard. It wasn't passion, it was instability dressed in adrenaline. You told yourself they were just busy, that they needed space, that maybe you were being too clingy. You memorized their excuses better than they memorized your birthday. You felt grateful for breadcrumbs because at least it meant they hadn't walked away, yet. You don't even realize how much peace you gave up just to say you had someone. You don't even notice how your body tenses every time their name pops up because you're never sure if they're going to make you feel wanted or worthless. That's not love, that's emotional gambling, and the house always wins. And then came the sixth standard you gave away without knowing, being chosen in public. You were the secret, the we're just talking, the never tagged, never introduced, never acknowledged version of almost love. You told yourself, maybe they're just private, maybe labels don't matter, but they do. Because when someone's proud of you, they don't hide you. You let someone keep you in the shadows just to avoid the ache of being alone in the light. You let someone make you feel like too much for the wrong reasons and not enough for the right ones. You didn't ask for more because you thought asking would mean losing them. But asking doesn't push away the right person. It reveals the wrong one. You were never too much. You were just with someone who offered too little. If you find yourself rereading their texts, this is for you. Because the seventh standard you lowered, the one that hurt the most, was self-respect. You started accepting things that used to break your heart. You began to call it growth, maturity, patience. But it wasn't any of those things, it was fear. Fear of the silence after goodbye. Fear of starting over. Fear of the mirror when there's no one to reflect your worth back at you. You stopped recognizing yourself. You caught your reflection mid-scroll and didn't know the person staring back. You weren't smiling like before. You weren't sleeping like before. You weren't dreaming like before. But you still stayed. Because staying felt less scary than grieving, and that's how they got you. Not because they were amazing, not because the connection was magical, but because you were tired of nights without notifications, mornings without good mornings. You weren't in love, you were in withdrawal, and they became your fix. But let me tell you something. Real love never asks you to abandon yourself. Real love makes you feel more like you, not less. It doesn't take your power away. It helps you step into it. You don't need to lower anything to be loved. You don't need to accept chaos to avoid loneliness. You don't need to shrink, beg, bend, or break. You were enough before them. You're enough without them. And you'll be more than enough for the one who chooses you without needing to be convinced. This wasn't a story about what you lost. It's a reminder of what you get to reclaim. Your standards are not obstacles. They're invitations for real, full, healthy love to find you. Stop waiting to be chosen. Start choosing you.